they never saw it coming. High above the clouds, in air so thin that most aircraft would gasp for breath, American bombers cruised as if the sky belonged to them alone. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was engineering, precise, ruthless, and decades ahead of its time. When the first formations of Boeing B-29 Superfortress appeared over Japan's homeland, they didn't just bring bombs, they brought a revolution in altitude. And the secret behind this supremacy was something almost invisible. A technology hidden deep inside the heart of each engine, the turbo-supercharger. Japan's military had planned carefully. Their air defense network was built on the assumption that invading bombers would arrive at predictable altitudes. Anti-aircraft guns were placed accordingly. Fighter interceptors were trained to climb to those levels and strike fast. Everything relied on controlling the skies between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. The usual ceiling of most heavy bombers at that time. What Japan didn't account for was an aircraft that would rewrite those numbers completely. The B-29 didn't just fly higher, it lived higher. It was designed from the ground up to cruise at altitudes the Japanese military thought were unreachable for sustained missions. Above 30,000 feet, where oxygen is scarce, temperatures plunge to extremes, and most aircraft engines begin to choke, the Superfortress soared with confidence. Its engines purred with a strength that seemed almost unnatural for that height. And that was precisely the point. Before the B-29 altitude was a kind of barrier. Even advanced bombers like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress struggled to maintain efficiency at high levels. Their engines would lose power as the air thinned, and their bomb loads had to be adjusted downward to compensate. Pilots fought against freezing temperatures and oxygen deprivation. Missions became riskier the higher they went, and that limitation shaped military strategy. But the B-29 was conceived to break barriers. The engineers understood that altitude wasn't just a number. It was an advantage. The higher an aircraft flies, the harder it is to intercept. Enemy fighters must climb longer, burning precious fuel and losing energy. Anti-aircraft guns become less accurate, and radar tracking becomes more challenging. If a bomber could live in that rarefied air comfortably, it would own the sky. So how did they do it? The answer is deceptively simple yet technologically revolutionary for its time: the exhaust-driven turbo-supercharger. Each of the B-29's 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines carried a device that could compress the thin air at high altitude, feeding the engine a dense, oxygen-rich mixture almost as if it were flying at sea level. That meant no power loss. That meant speed, range, and payload all remained formidable even at 30,000 feet. The turbo-supercharger worked like a secret breathing machine. It used exhaust gases, usually wasted energy, to spin a turbine that compressed incoming air before it reached the carburetor. This compressed air gave the engines their full strength, allowing the bomber to maintain climb rates and cruising speeds that seemed almost impossible to the Japanese defenders below. It was as if the bomber had lungs bigger than the sky itself. Imagine standing on the ground in Japan, looking up at faint silver dots leaving white trails against the deep blue. You can hear the distant thrum of engines, but you can't touch them. Fighter pilots scrambled their Mitsubishi A6M0 interceptors, engines screaming as they clawed at the sky. But by the time they reached those heights, the B-29 formations had already released their bombs or simply cruised out of reach. Speed and altitude weren't just statistics. They were shields. The Japanese command had underestimated what American engineering could deliver in such a short time. Their own aircraft struggled with performance above 25,000 feet. The Zero, legendary in the early war years for its agility and climb, began to falter where the B-29 operated. Interceptors lacked the turbo-charging technology needed to chase bombers to the stratosphere effectively. Anti-aircraft artillery, already stretched thin, couldn't aim accurately at bombers so high and fast. What made this shift even more devastating was how quietly it unfolded at first. When the first B-29 missions began, Japanese radar operators were startled to find blips appearing at altitudes they weren't used to seeing. Reports flooded command posts. Enemy bombers are too high. Artillery crews fired desperately, watching shells burst far below the targets. Fighter squadrons burned precious fuel in vertical climbs that left them exhausted before they could even get into firing range. The Americans had effectively removed a key part of Japan's air defense equation, and for the men flying the B-29s, that altitude wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. They knew they were beyond easy reach. They could focus on their mission with less fear of sudden interception. The turbo-superchargers gave them something priceless in war: control. But this wasn't some effortless miracle. The technology that enabled this leap had been years in the making. The turbo-supercharger wasn't a brand new invention. It had been tested and refined through earlier American bombers. But for the B-29 it was perfected. Every component of the aircraft was designed to work with it. From the pressurized cabin to the fuel systems, everything was built to sustain long-range, high-altitude bombing missions. That's why the Japanese strategists miscalculated so badly. They assumed the next wave of bombers would be incremental improvements, a bit faster, a bit higher, a bit tougher. Instead, they got a machine that leaped over their expectations entirely. They were preparing to fight the last war. America was already fighting the next one. The psychological shock was enormous. The B-29 was not only fast and high-flying but also massive, carrying bomb loads far beyond what earlier bombers could handle. Japanese cities that had once seemed distant, almost unreachable, suddenly lay within striking range. Factories, supply lines, ports, and even symbolic centers of power were exposed. And all of it was made possible by the power hidden beneath the engine cowlings. When Japanese fighter pilots finally managed to climb to interception altitude, they often found themselves too late or too slow. The B-29 formations didn't need to fight. They could simply glide away above the chaos. The defenders were fighting a ghost, one that lived where their machines couldn't breathe. And as the war ground on, the situation only worsened. The Japanese military tried to adapt. They experimented with tactics, threw more aircraft into the air, and tried night interceptions. But the technological gap was merciless. Without their own turbo-supercharger technology at scale, they could never truly challenge the B-29 on equal terms. Looking back, the arrival of the B-29 over Japan marked a turning point, not just in the Pacific War but in the entire philosophy of aerial warfare. Altitude became not just an advantage but a weapon. And at the center of that weapon was a machine small enough to fit inside an engine nacelle, but powerful enough to rewrite strategy, the turbo-supercharger. The Japanese air defense network was never meant to fight enemies that operated in the stratosphere. Their entire system, from radar placement to interceptor tactics, was designed around conventional assumptions. Bombers would fly low enough to track and high enough to avoid some ground fire, but always within a range that their anti-aircraft guns and fighters could reach. That worked fine against the older generation of aircraft. But when the Boeing B-29 Superfortress appeared, those assumptions shattered like glass. Every detail of the B-29's design amplified its altitude advantage. The turbo-superchargers weren't just there to boost engine power. They defined the aircraft's strategy. While most bombers of the era were forced to pick between payload and altitude, the B-29 could carry its bomb load and still climb above 30,000 feet. That combination made it a nightmare to intercept. Japanese pilots often described the B-29 as if it were a ghost fortress, something that hovered just out of reach, raining destruction from the edge of the heavens. The B-29's engines were the key. Each of its Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines produced over 200 horsepower, but only because the turbo-superchargers kept feeding them dense air even when the natural atmosphere grew thin. That meant the aircraft maintained performance where Japanese planes lost it. And in aerial combat, losing power means losing the fight before it even begins. Japanese interceptors like the Mitsubishi A-Sim-0, Kawasaki Ki-87 Hien, and later the Nakajima Ki-87 Hayate were exceptional in many ways, fast, agile, and deadly at low to medium altitudes. But their piston engines relied on mechanical superchargers, and those had limits. Above 25,000 feet, the air was too thin for these systems to keep the engines running at full power. The fighters slowed down, their climb rate dropped, and their maneuverability suffered dramatically. By the time they reached 30,000 feet, many could barely keep up with the bombers, let alone engage them effectively. Even if a Zero pilot managed to claw their way to the bomber's altitude, they arrived exhausted, their aircraft struggling, and their fuel nearly depleted. Meanwhile, the B-29s cruised comfortably, engines humming steadily, ready to turn away or climb higher. It wasn't a fair fight. This imbalance forced Japan to rethink its defensive strategy. Commanders began deploying fighters in orbiting patrols, trying to catch the bombers early. They placed more aircraft near potential targets and attempted head-on attack formations to maximize firing time. But the bombers' altitude advantage gave them too much flexibility. They could approach from unexpected directions, maintain formation in the cold upper air, and strike with precision. And then there was another devastating advantage: pressurization. Unlike most aircraft of the era, the B-29 had a fully pressurized cabin. For its crews, that meant no cumbersome oxygen masks for the entire flight, no frostbite-inducing winds, no endless fatigue from struggling against the cold. The bomber crews could operate for long hours with better focus and coordination. Japanese fighter pilots, on the other hand, battled the freezing air in thin cockpits at the edge of their aircraft's performance envelope. That technological leap made a very human difference. Fatigue kills focus. Lack of oxygen slows reflexes. Every second mattered when fighters tried to intercept those silver giants. The Americans had created a machine that made its own environment, living comfortably where others gasped for breath, and the effect wasn't just tactical, it was psychological and strategic. When Japan's own intelligence analysts examined B-29 wreckage after rare successful shootdowns, they were stunned. The complexity of the turbo-supercharger systems was unlike anything they'd mass-produced. The precision engineering required, the materials involved, the sheer industrial capacity behind such aircraft. It told them something chilling: the United States wasn't just ahead in the air, it was ahead in industry. Each turbo-supercharger unit represented thousands of man-hours of precision machining. Japan's factories, already strained by years of war and bombing, simply couldn't replicate this technology on a meaningful scale. Their aircraft remained bound to lower altitudes, while American bombers operated in what felt like another dimension. The arrival of the B-29 forced Japan into increasingly desperate measures. They developed special high-altitude interceptor units. They tried to modify existing aircraft with better superchargers. They experimented with ramming tactics, hoping to bring down bombers by sheer sacrifice. But these were stopgaps against a machine designed from day one to dominate the upper sky. And as the bombers kept coming, something else began to change: the shape of the war itself. Unlike earlier raids that relied on hitting military targets, the B-29s gave the U.S. the reach to strike Japan's industrial heartland directly. The bombers flew from faraway bases and reached deep into Japanese territory. Cities that had once been considered untouchable, like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, now lay within their grasp. At first, the raids came in daylight, using altitude to minimize losses. Japanese defenses tried their best, but each mission exposed the same problem. By the time interceptors got there, it was too late. Anti-aircraft guns, already limited in number and quality, couldn't reach high enough or hit accurately at such altitudes. Shells exploded harmlessly below the bombers, filling the sky with black puffs that looked threatening but did little real damage. For Japanese civilians, the B-29s became a symbol of unstoppable destruction. They were too high to see clearly, too distant to shoot down, and too powerful to ignore. Air raid sirens would sound. People would look up at the faint contrails streaking the sky, and they knew bombs were already falling. The terror wasn't just in the explosions. It was in the helplessness that came before them. Inside Japan's military headquarters, frustration turned to grim realization. They weren't just losing aircraft. They were losing the air war itself. Their fighter force was fighting uphill, their anti-aircraft defenses outdated, and their industrial base too strained to keep up with the technological pace. Meanwhile, American aircrews grew more confident. Flying at 30,000 feet, they knew that only a rare and lucky Japanese fighter would ever get close enough to pose a serious threat. That confidence translated into effectiveness. Bombing accuracy improved, mission success rates rose, and the psychological advantage tilted further. The turbo-supercharger became more than a machine. It became a force multiplier. With it, each B-29 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a high-altitude fortress, untouchable by most of what Japan could throw at it. And the Americans knew it. Strategic planners leaned on this advantage, sending wave after wave of bombers, pushing Japan's defenses past the breaking point. As the months passed, Japanese interceptors increasingly resorted to desperate measures. Some pilots took off knowing they wouldn't have enough fuel to return. Others climbed straight into the bomber streams, guns blazing, hoping to inflict at least some damage before their engines starved for oxygen. They were fighting a war they couldn't win, because the battlefield itself had shifted upwards. From the ground, watching a formation of B-29s was surreal. Dozens of massive silver aircraft, their wings glinting in the sun, glided far beyond the reach of most weapons. The sound came seconds late, carried on the wind from high above. They didn't seem like planes. They seemed like something otherworldly. Machines that lived where the air was too thin for humans. In a war defined by innovation, the turbo-supercharger was quiet but decisive. Japan's defenses were built for a world where altitude was limited. America built a bomber that broke that limit, and once the sky was no longer contested at the same level, everything beneath it became vulnerable. By the time Japan truly understood what the Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented, the war had already tilted against them. It wasn't just another bomber. It was a technological spear aimed directly at the heart of their homeland, and at the center of that spear, buried deep in the engines, was the quiet but devastating innovation of the turbo-supercharger. As American strategy shifted into high gear, B-29 raids grew larger, more coordinated and more relentless. Operating from bases as far away as the Marianas, these aircraft could strike cities that had previously seemed untouchable. At their cruising altitude of 30,000 feet, they didn't just bypass defenses, they erased them from the equation. Fighter squadrons, radar operators, and artillery crews were forced to react to an enemy they could barely reach, let alone defeat. The altitude advantage wasn't only about surviving the trip, it was about controlling time itself. Japanese interceptors needed precious minutes to climb to such heights. By the time they reached engagement altitude, the bombers had often completed their runs and turned for home. This gave the Americans almost total operational freedom. They could choose when to strike, where to strike, and how long to stay, a luxury unheard of in earlier bombing campaigns. Inside the turbo-supercharger, physics itself became a weapon. As the bomber climbed, the thin air would normally starve engines of oxygen, robbing them of power. But the B-29's turbo system kept feeding the engines the same rich oxygen flow they'd have at sea level. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines roared at full strength, even where most aircraft struggled just to stay aloft. That meant speed, that meant range. That meant the bomber could keep its massive payload and still remain out of reach. Japan, on the other hand, was stuck fighting with machines built for a lower sky. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been legendary in the early war, nimble, fast, and deadly, but it had no turbo-supercharger. At 30,000 feet, it gasped for air, its engine's power faded, its climb slowed, and its maneuverability collapsed. Even the more advanced Nakajima Ki-87 Hayate struggled to sustain performance at the same altitude. That wasn't a tactical problem. It was a strategic one. Japan simply didn't have the industrial capacity to develop, mass-produce, and maintain complex turbo-supercharging systems on a national scale. These machines required advanced alloys, precision machining, and large-scale manufacturing, things Japan's war-torn economy couldn't sustain. And so mission after mission, the B-29s came. They were so high that ground observers sometimes couldn't even see them clearly. Just silver specks and long white contrails painting the deep blue. By the time the sirens wailed, the bomb bay doors were already opening. At first, the U.S. focused on daylight precision bombing, using the altitude advantage to minimize losses. But as the campaign wore on, tactics evolved. American commanders realized that the Japanese defenses were so weak at high altitudes that they could adapt their strategy entirely. They began to fly at night, at slightly lower altitudes, maximizing bomb load and expanding target lists. And Japan could do little to stop them. It wasn't just the bombs that inflicted damage, it was the relentlessness. High-altitude raids gave American forces a near-invulnerable way to attack Japan's cities, industries, and infrastructure. Factories couldn't run without power. Transportation systems collapsed under repeated strikes. Entire urban centers were reduced to rubble. And through it all, the turbo-supercharger kept the bombers flying, mission after mission. For Japanese civilians, it became a grim routine. The faint hum in the upper atmosphere. The distant glint of silver. The thunder of bombs moments later. Air raid shelters could offer only so much. Anti-aircraft fire became background noise, mostly ineffective against aircraft that flew far above the black puffs of exploding shells. In Tokyo, the situation grew worse with each passing month. The high-altitude advantage of the B-29s meant the Americans could strike the capital repeatedly with minimal losses. Firebombing raids reduced large swaths of the city to ashes. Other cities, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, followed the same fate, and with Japan's interceptor force worn thin, there was no meaningful way to strike back. The Japanese military tried everything. Some pilots resorted to kamikaze-style ramming attacks against bomber formations. Others climbed in modified interceptors stripped of weight, trying to squeeze out just a little more altitude. A few managed to reach the bombers and score kills, but it was like throwing pebbles at a mountain. The B-29 fleet was too large, too well defended, and too high. The turbo-supercharger had done something that bombs alone could never do. It changed the geometry of the war. Instead of fighting over contested airspace, the Americans owned a layer of the sky that Japan simply couldn't reach. That turned every mission into a one-sided contest. And as every strategist knows, wars are not won by meeting the enemy on equal terms. They are won by reshaping the battlefield. Even the best Japanese pilots, men with years of experience who had fought and won in the early years of the war, found themselves helpless. Their machines were outclassed, their altitudes limited, their tactics outdated. It wasn't lack of skill that doomed them, it was physics and technology. As the raids continued, the psychological toll deepened. Japanese cities burned, their skies streaked with the contrails of bombers flying where no one could follow. Civilians spoke of the B-29s with a mix of awe and dread, almost like forces of nature rather than machines. High above, crews operated in heated pressurized cabins communicating with precision, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on targets far below. And then came the final blow. The same aircraft that Japan struggled to intercept became the delivery system for the weapon that ended the war. In August 1945, B-29s carried atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The turbo-superchargers ensured the aircraft could climb, fly long distances, and deliver their deadly payload with reliability. In that moment, the altitude advantage wasn't just tactical, it became world-changing. When Japan surrendered, it wasn't just because of a single bomb or a single raid. It was because their defenses had been systematically dismantled from above. The turbo-supercharger was never a headline-grabbing piece of technology, but it was one of the most decisive engineering innovations of the entire war. After the war, nations around the world took note. High-altitude flight became a cornerstone of modern strategic bombing. The lessons of the B-29 program shaped future aircraft, faster, higher, more powerful. But none of it would have been possible without the ability to make engines breathe in the thin air of the stratosphere. For Japan, the story of the B-29's turbo-supercharger is a story of technological surprise. They had prepared for a war fought in one layer of the sky. America fought in another. And that difference, invisible from the ground, hidden inside an engine, decided the fate of entire cities. The contrails faded. The bombers returned to their bases. The war ended. But the legacy of those high-altitude fortresses remained. They were proof that wars are often won not just by courage, not just by numbers, but by innovation. By creating a machine that could live where the enemy could not. The United States had reshaped the battlefield entirely. Today, when historians talk about the turning points of the Pacific War, they often mention the atomic bomb or decisive naval battles. But long before those moments, the balance had already shifted. It shifted the day the first B-29 climbed into the stratosphere and no Japanese aircraft could follow. That was the quiet, relentless power of the turbo-supercharger, a piece of engineering so effective that it turned the sky itself into a weapon.